série de questions et d'échanges avec les membres du jury, et puis la délibération finale.
Merci. Merci, Dr. Pellissier. Merci à tous pour votre présence ici et ma soutenance de thèse. Je vais changer à anglais pour le bénéfice de moi-même et aussi autres membres de l'audience. And say good morning to everybody, and I'm basically here to present, as you can see, my PhD project, which was about forest type mapping in French Guiana. And so the first thing in terms of some context for why this project, as we're probably all aware, tropical forests are extremely important. And they're important because of the functions and the services they provide. Here we can see the locations of these tropical forests across the Americas, Africa, Asia. And in addition to the important services they have, tropical forests are extremely biodiverse in terms of having hundreds of tree species per hectare. However, according to different studies, they are threatened from the point of view of deforestation, as well as the different species which are at extinction risk, such as this graphic here from Technische et al. 2015, where they estimated that up to almost 60% of Amazonian tree species are at risk of becoming extinct over the next few decades. Therefore, there is this urgent need for us to assess the state of tropical forests. And basically, one of the ways in which we understand tropical forests comes from detailed studies in the field, transects, plots that have been laid out for monitoring across these tropical regions. However, in terms of the current networks of monitoring plots, represents really only a very small fraction of 1% of the entire surface of the 16.2 million square kilometers that are tropical forests. Therefore, we have to turn to other sources of information in addition to these plots, one of which is remote sensing. And why remote sensing? Because first off, remote sensing provides us with both a landscape view of tropical forests, as we can see there, as well as a global view. They also allow us to visualize the spatial patterns of canopy reflectance, as we can see here. And when we can combine this type of remote sensing information, which is representing the canopy reflectance, the light that is being reflected by the forest canopies, when we can combine this with field information, we can then upscale these observations and have a better understanding of what it is this type of information shows us. And in addition to that, being able to merge, to combine both the field data as well as remotely sensed data. Remotely sensed data has the benefit of usually regular collection of data, and this type of information has been around since the 1970s. What does it show? It shows, for instance, as mentioned, patterns of reflected light off of canopies, because this is what the satellite sensors are able to see. And then these canopy patterns can then be transformed into other types of information, such as this vegetation index that I show here, called the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a product then of the satellite image that we just saw before. And essentially, there are also multiple products that can be derived from satellite data, multiple types of indices. For instance, the Enhanced Vegetation Index or the Normalized Vegetation Index. And how are these indices calculated? They're calculated from for the most part, simple ratioing of the different parts of the radiation that canopies reflect. So for instance, here we see how NDVI is calculated by a ratio of the difference between the near infrared reflectance and red reflectance, and divided by the sum of both. In addition to that, the link of this remote sensing data with the field is that what we see in those canopy images are really representations of both the structure of the forest as well as their physiology. So for instance, as we can see here, a healthy tree will reflect certain quantities of both red and near infrared radiation or light, and unhealthy trees or trees with less leaves, for instance, will reflect different quantities of red and near-infrared reflectance. And again, the benefit of this is being able to see all of this at the level of an entire landscape or level of a country or the entire world, as mentioned before. And there are multiple sources of data for this, being able to produce these vegetation indices. In this presentation, I'll talk a lot about data coming from SPOT, from MODIS, from Landsat, and these are basically just different sources of remote sensed data. And in addition to that, and lastly, vegetation indices as a product of satellite imagery allows us to monitor the trends in these forests over time. And here, what we see are, it's the enhanced vegetation index that's derived from MODIS. And from a study, Huet et al. 2006, where again, we can look over time and see how the greenness of these forests have changed. However, in addition to sources like MODIS, France's very own space agency had the SPOT, the vegetation instrument, which also collected data on vegetation indices for a long period of time. Taking all of that into context, the other big thing is that even though we have access to remotely sensed data, there are gaps as well as challenges that we have to deal with. And so again, back to the point of using field data to upscale our observations, one of the gaps is, again, the representativity of the current network of field plots, which are, again, limited. And from the point of view of remote sensing, basically, one of the issues that we're confronted is that maps that are generated at either the national or the global level are generated at in extremely broad physiognomic classes, whether we're talking about deciduous versus evergreen forests, or we're talking about broadleaf versus needleaf forests. And this has led to what we term the green carpet effect for tropical forests, where using remotely sensed data for the most part, we're again just seeing broad expanses of forest, and we don't really know what's in those forests, what are the different forest types. And one of the biggest challenges to being able to use this type of data, as we can see here, basically areas in red, a lot of the areas of tropical forests are covered persistently by cloud cover, which does not allow us to basically see what's under the cloud. In addition to that, there's another challenge, which I'll get into in a little bit, the bidirectional reflectance distribution function, which is something that affects satellite imagery particularly. And so the big question coming off of all of this, one big question is, can we unravel, can we understand, can we dig deeper into these green carpets? So BRDF, the bidirectional reflectance distribution function, as mentioned before, it's something that affects satellite imagery, but really it affects any kind of remotely sensed data, including this simple aerial photograph that we have here. And basically one of the things that all of us can see, it's an area of forest actually close to Dresden, Germany, where Pierre and I did our co-tutelle with Professor Berger. And here we have trees which, because of the position of the sun, appear bright green. And then you have trees which are essentially in shadow or being shadowed. And so when the camera takes an image of this forest, it sees bright trees over here, dark trees over here. And this creates a problem when we look at other types of data. So for instance, if we look at a satellite image of a broad landscape, you and I might not be able to tell, but there's actually a gradient in brightness across this image. And this gradient in brightness is, again, affected by the position of the sun as well as the sensor, which is capturing this image. So even though we might not be able to see it, basically the forests on this side appear artificially brighter, while the forests on this side appear artificially darker. But again, it's a little tricky to be able to see. And that is a function of how the image was captured by remote sensing sensors. In that case, it was Landsat capturing this image, and basically, because the sensor can't see everything at the same angle, there's a scan, and so the forests which are captured, say on the western part of the image, are seen again in sun, and the forests on the eastern part of the scene are seen relatively shadowed. And this is a problem not only for looking at landscape patterns, but also for looking at patterns in time. And so just briefly to mention here, back in 2006, there was a study, 2007, a study published by Celeste et al., where they indicated that based on their analysis of satellite data over time, they were seeing a greening of the Amazon during the dry season. In 2014, some years later, this study was rebutted by a different study, but not using satellite imagery, but using radiative transfer modeling, where they argued that what Celeste et al. Had actually seen was rather a green illusion based on, again, BRDF and basically the configuration of how the satellite sensors were imaging these areas. And so this Morton et al. Study in 2014 basically raised a big problem in terms of studies which before it hadn't considered the issues of BRDF in studying the temporal variation of forests. And so the question that that study really raised was, whether it's even feasible to use satellite data to look at temporal changes in tropical forests, specifically where we're not so sure about the phenology of the trees in those forests. That said, coming into specifically what this project is dealing with, for this thesis, I, along with my advisors, decided to focus on the area of French Guiana as a case study really for other types of tropical forests, because ultimately this type of study could have been done anywhere. And the first one was, from 2011, there had been a study by Penick et al. That had been looking at using remotely sensed data to look at phenology of evergreen forests in French Guiana. However, in the context of this Morton et al. Study, that's really called into question. In addition to that, from just the basis of the spatial variation of the forests, there have been a number of global studies, such as this one here, Globe Cover from the European Space Agency, that basically show French Guiana as one big green mass of forest, this big green carpet. And again, researchers from French Guiana, people studying French Guiana, know that the forests of French Guiana are actually more diverse than these green carpet global maps would show. And so here we have Landsat imagery of French Guiana, where we can actually see different tones of green reflectance, which would indicate that there are actually multiple types of forests in French Guiana. And in addition to that, we have here researchers such as Stéphane Guettet himself, who last year published a study that was able to go further into the green carpet to unravel it, to look at forest types. Dr. Sabatier and other colleagues, I saw Professor Molino, who collaborated with Gond et al. Also in doing another study looking at forests in French Guiana. Here on the left, we have the forest landscapes, which were mapped using satellite reflectance data by Gond et al. And here we have the forest types from Stéphane Guettet, using sample plot data, which was then trained on geomorphological data. Here are the different types of forests that they were able to drill into. For instance, in Gond et al.'s map, in the yellow areas in the south, we have an agglomeration of both open and palm forests. And then again, Stéphane's work, we see quite a different panorama of forest types based on field data intensively used along with geomorphologic data. And so again, this just in terms of the previous data that we have to bear. And then wrapping up and getting into what the overall objectives for this study were. Basically, this thesis that I'll be presenting will focus on three axes, one of which was evaluating the spatial distributions of forests, linking those or trying to understand the temporal behavior variation of tropical forests, and then linking both of those to combine both the spatial and temporal patterns to look at what we consider ecologically consistent mapping of tropical forest types. And why? Because in terms of the ecology of all of this, just to bring up a quote from Chav, that basically the goal of community ecology is not just to explain the patterns which we're going to see, but also to document them to understand the processes which generate those patterns. And so, before diving a little bit deeper, and apologies if I'm talking a little too fast, the different terms that I'll be bringing up again and again are canopy reflectance estimates. So again, just the light that is reflected by the canopies of the trees, which we can see using satellite sensors. Also vegetation indices, which are just the products of this canopy reflectance data. And again and again, I've mentioned the sources of the data that will be used, particularly in this study, We'll also use other sources, but we're using Landsat, which is a series of satellites from the US, MODIS, a sensor which is quite similar to the ones on Landsat, but has allowed for almost daily mapping of forests, and SPOT, from which we have spot vegetation, similar to MODIS. And so on the issue of the spatial variation, we have the first questions which had to do with basically how BRDF, which I'd mentioned before, affect both the spectral response of the tropical forests, their canopy reflectance, as well as how we can estimate the distributions of forests based on those patterns of spectral response. And then also trying to tie this into the temporal factor, how these estimated distributions that we've generated might vary in time. And so the overall approach that was taken, we characterized the BRDF in Landsat specific data. We then did an adjustment, which I'll get into. We were able to map the forest types of that single Landsat reflectance data. And then we also looked at mapping over time using a time series of MODIS data. And so how did we do this? Basically, again, with cloud cover being a challenge, one of the things, along with other researchers in the lab, we were able to select some of basically the most cloud-free images of French Guiana and acquire those. So we ended up with images which overall represented with less than 2% cloud cover. Because of some of the technical issues, we had to do some processing, filling of that data. We corrected this data for atmospheric effects. We also did corrections for topography, since topography also affects BRDF. And then we ended up with a first version of a mosaic of the canopy reflectance of French Guiana, again, based on Landsat. And then we did something that I'm going to be getting into in step one, an adjustment of that raw Landsat data. And then after that, using that data, we were able to map forest types. And so just to get into the steps of, or the methodology behind that, again, just showing this is what the reflectance data coming from Landsat looked like. Again, had low cloud cover. However, again, as we can see here, there are issues in terms of the illumination across the different tracks of imagery that were acquired. Therefore, in this case, we used an average of reflectance data that was collected by a different sensor, MODIS, averaged from some 12 years of observations of MODIS from almost daily data. Again, specifically for September. And basically what did we do? We took these two images, essentially we subtracted both, and in subtracting them, spectral band by spectral band, or the different reflectance patterns, and we saw some interesting patterns. So for instance, in all the cases of the different bands, spectral bands which were subtracted, we again saw this gradient of differences in reflectance where, again, forests on the east being more shadowed, forests in the west being brighter. And then based on that, the BRDF correction, using the very subtractions that I just showed you, we then, using a polynomial regression, we did a 10th order polynomial to then adjust the reflectance of Landsat to basically get what we have here, which was to decrease the brightness on the western side of the Landsat images, increase the brightness on the eastern side in order to normalize the image, again, taking the patterns from MODIS to do this normalization. And the result, as we can see here, was a mosaic of canopy reflectance of French Guiana, which was BRDF adjusted, balanced using MODIS data. And then in addition to that, in terms of the actual mapping of the forest types, in terms of French Guiana, there are quite a lot of transects scattered across the country, the territory. However, these transects, again, don't represent everything. And then working with other researchers, we're able to take a subset of those transects and use them as training sites, essentially, for an algorithm which then took this reflectance data and then, based on a classification scheme of different types of forests which had been evaluated, we were able to create profiles of what the different canopy patterns per forest type were. And the result was a map of an estimate of the distributions of the types of forest, again, based on this 12 forest classification scheme and based on the BRDF adjusted Landsat image from one particular set of dates in September over French Guiana. And in terms, we also took the same process And we had done this on the data which had not been corrected for BRDF, not been balanced. And what we see here is the map of distributions based on data which has not been adjusted, a map of distributions based on the data that was adjusted. And basically, one of the things that we can see is that there's little similarity really between the two maps, or less than 30% similarity. And as we can see here, basically the distributions that we see in the map, which was based on the data which wasn't corrected, seem to be a product of, again, the lack of correction. So it's giving us distributions that don't look very feasible. And so in terms of an overall synthesis for what we just saw, the first set of results that we have are that in terms of the Landsat estimates of canopy reflectance, we were able to conclude that the estimates of reflectance are biased along the angle of the scan of the satellite sensor. However, the biases depend on the different wavelengths of light used, and those biases show themselves up as strong east-west artifacts in terms of actually mapping the forest types. So again, when we look at this, we see forest types that don't seem to be feasible. And in addition to that, we saw that, again, the bias affected the overall mapping of the forest types. The MODIS reference reflectance data that we used, however, did not show the bias that we could see in Landsat, this east-west pattern of bias in canopy reflectance. And the forest types mapped using this corrected data seem to indicate distributions which were more realistic. The other part of this research related to this, so if the Landsat study that was just shown was based only on one single data of imagery, in this case we were able to use BRDF corrected MODIS data but taken over a series of time. And so we're able to map forest type distributions, for instance, in most of the dry season. And one of the things that was seen when using this type of approach was that the numbers of types of forest actually changed over time. And to show this more graphically, here is a map of forest types derived using MODIS reflectance data from August, canopy reflectance data from September, and just for us to hone in on a few areas where we can see that, again, the distributions that were mapped changed depending on the month, changed from month to month. And so the overall conclusion of this, and wish I could get a little more into that, was that, for one, the estimated distributions of the forest types will vary month to month when we have access to data like MODIS, which allows us to look at forests over time, which isn't the case with Landsat. However, the changes that we saw here, we can't necessarily attribute them to issues such as BRDF, because the input data that we used were already corrected for BRDF. But the big take home from this was that if we're looking to map the distributions of tropical types of forests, the distributions that we estimate will really be based on the dates of when the canopy reflectance are observed. And so this issue of it all depending on the date takes us into the next axis of this research, which have to do with temporal variation of forests. And it had three questions which dealt with whether the variation in vegetation indices, if we modeled it just as a function of the changes in the sun over the year, whether that would correlate with what's observed by satellite, the extent to which the variation could actually be explained by other factors such as climate or atmosphere, and then also what this type of data indicated in terms of the seasonality of forests in French Guiana specifically. What I'm going to be presenting will be based at different scales. So we're going to look at a stand level analysis, we're going to look at a site and territorial level analysis, and also an analysis comparing different regions of tropical forests, the Guiana Shield in South America, Central Africa, and also northern Borneo. That said, the first part of this study, which had to do with stand-based modeling, again, looking at French Guiana, we decided to look at three specific sites on a north-south transect of French Guiana, the field site of Paracou, Nourag, and Etoupé. And in terms of the differences between these three sites, the main differences that would be useful for you to know are that the three sites varied much in terms of their structure, their architecture. So for instance, the forests at Paracou overall were taller than the other forests, they were more dense than the other forests, and had a more closed canopy compared with, say, the forest at Etoupé, which had the largest gap fraction or the largest opening in the canopy. And basically, Etoupé and Nourag were, say, not as dense as the forest at Paracou. However, the forests at Nourag that were chosen for study were mainly flat, while the others at Paracou and Etoupé had gentle slopes. And so what did we do? We used the DART, the Discrete Anisotropic Radiative Transfer Model developed by Professor Gastelou and his team at CESBio in Toulouse. And basically, DART allows us, using information on structure, forest structure in this case, to trace how the rays of light will pass through the canopy, be intercepted, be absorbed, be retransmitted, etc., and will allow us then to estimate what canopy reflectance would be based on structure. And the key inputs that DART uses, or we used in this case, were data on atmospheric profile, the density of the forest, the orientation of the leaves, the optical properties of the leaves themselves, and also solar direction. And specifically in the modeling that we did, the main driver of change that we were looking at was just to see how just varying solar direction, what that would indicate. And so first off, we started with LiDAR, which are laser estimates of forest structure, taken over these different sites in French Guiana. That data was input into a platform, a MapVox, developed by researchers at AMAP. And using a MapVox, we were able to use that structural information to estimate the transmittance of the leaves, basically the ability of the light to pass through the leaves. And then based on those estimates of transmittance, it gave, based on the structure, the transmittance, estimates of the density of the vegetation. And then based on that, estimates of the vegetation in combination with DART, we're able to simulate what the canopies look like. And not only were we able to simulate what the canopies look like, we're able to actually simulate what they look like over the course of a year. And so again, we did this modeling at level of 1 hectare stands for these three different sites that I mentioned. And here are the results in terms of the patterns we see from the three sites and how these patterns match up with the solar direction changes, which were what was driving these changes. And so as we can all see, basically independent of the architecture of the three sites, we see patterns which strongly match the pattern of the changes in the elevation of the sun. And as would be expected, Paracou, which had the densest forest, overall the big difference between the three, the patterns are quite similar, but it's the magnitude that's different, and the magnitude was dependent on the density of the forest at the different sites. So Paracou, the densest forest, had the highest magnitude. Etoupé, with the least dense forest, had the least magnitude. We then compared the patterns that we saw in the dark green, and apologize for this, but in the light green, if we can see it, is the actual pattern that we get from satellite imagery. So here in green, the pattern we modeled, or dark green pattern we modeled, light green, the pattern that comes from the satellite imagery. And what we can see is that the patterns don't really match. Therefore, something must have been happening. So just to synthesize, to conclude what we were seeing there, based solely on our modeling, one of the conclusions that we can come up with is if the changes that we see in the forest are only due to the changes in solar elevation, changes in solar direction, and there is no phenology occurring, then we should see very green forests in April and September. Very green in terms of what we showed here in terms of how the pattern of vegetation indices are. However, we didn't see that. And in addition to that, we also see when we compare the different architectures of forests, all three architectures, we still get this similar bimodal pattern. And again, what we observed from satellite data doesn't match what we modeled, again, based only on changes in the sun's position, which would suggest something else. And what does that suggest? So we did a different study not using stand-based modeling now, but analyzing satellite data over 3 regions, again, the Guyanas, Central Africa, and Northern Borneo. And basically, we looked at, could we explain the pattern of variation in the vegetation indices in terms of climatic variation, in terms of that would be a real response, or was that to do with how the atmosphere is varying over the year, or is it to do with changes in the sun's position, BRDF, which we would consider then artifacts in the data. And what we found, which was striking, and please look closely on these slides, basically the pattern that we see over the Guyanas and the pattern that we see in Central Africa and the pattern that we see in Northern Borneo are quite different. And if I didn't mention it before, why did we look at these 3 areas? Why? Because from what we know about BRDF, if BRDF was the driver of what we're seeing in terms of the changes in the vegetation indices, then we would expect that since these 3 areas are on the same latitudes and basically have the same solar regime in terms of the changes in how the sun is moving, then these 3 areas should have the same patterns in their vegetation index variation. However, again, as we can all see, the patterns are quite different, particularly when we look at the Guyanas and Central Africa. And then when we actually compared this data with these potential drivers that I mentioned before, climate, atmospheric noise, solar elevation, what we see here is that basically the pattern in the different vegetation indices, and here again we looked at multiple vegetation indices and compared that with, say, the pattern of radiation in the Guyanas, more or less the pattern of the vegetation indices seem to match the availability of light, of solar radiation, whereas in Central Africa, the pattern in the vegetation index variation more or less matched the pattern of rainfall. In the case of Borneo, the signals didn't necessarily match with any of the drivers we were looking at. However, when we compare this to earlier studies such as Wagner et al. 2016, which was published earlier this year, they found that in looking at different tropical areas, that the seasonality of the gross primary productivity of tropical forests, when these tropical forests receive less than 2,000 millimeters of rainfall, that their seasonality is synchronized with rainfall. And so that seems to be the case of what we're seeing with Central Africa, because the site that we looked at, or overall this large area, the rainfall is less than 2,000 millimeters a year. So again, the take home there is, if BRDF really drives the variation in vegetation indices, we should have expected to see similar patterns along the equator. This was not the case, which would suggest that BRDF isn't what is driving the change in the vegetation indices, because in fact we saw distinct patterns for the 3 regions. When we do statistical analysis, we find that climatic variation actually explains most of the variation for both the Guyanas and Central Africa. And again, we find that the patterns of the change in the vegetation indices are synchronized differently across regions. So in French Guiana, the pattern of variation of the vegetation indices is synchronized with solar radiation, whereas in Central Africa, it's synchronized with rainfall. Furthermore, an additional study that didn't have time to include here, we found that when we do use data which is properly corrected for BRDF, we again still see this strong seasonal pattern in French Guiana's forests, but more than that, these patterns strongly differ by types of forest, which, taking this together along with what we could see from the spatial axis, it comes to the last part of this presentation, which has to do with the focus on spatial temporal variation, and basically to what extent could we utilize both spatial and temporal information from remote sensing to come up with a consistent characterization of the spatial patterns of forest types. And so overall, in terms of what we did, we were able to take again this BRDF corrected MODIS data compiled over a long time series of 12 years. Using that canopy reflectance data, we extracted the enhanced vegetation index from them. We did spatial and temporal filtering to the data to account for clouds and other issues. And then we did a time series composition technique, which I'll explain a little bit. And so in a time series composition, basically, for any given area of forest, we could, based on the 12 years of data, construct a history of how the reflectance as represented here by the enhanced vegetation index, how that changed over time, And we're able, using statistical techniques of putting moving windows to look at the underlying pattern here to come up with what the repeating seasonal pattern is, as well as what the overall trend is, as well as, say, noise in the data that causes the different years to look different. So basically, for each area of forest, we did this kind of decomposition. And then with those patterns, we were able to group them together using an algorithm called unsupervised classification or clustering. And then we compared those to a limited extent with data on environmental gradients that we had access to. And so the results that we had, again, show that for French Guiana, based on this large time series of data, if we extract what the average pattern of seasonal or monthly variation is from January to December, we see that different areas of forest will vary both in space and time, in terms of how dense, how green the vegetation is. Some areas basically maintaining their greenness over time, other areas having quite large differences. And when we then cluster these, we could come up with a map that showed the 5 main areas of the phenology of French Guiana, with areas in green, for instance, areas with much stronger seasonality than, say, the areas in blue, such as, say, the mangrove forests on the coast and other forests in the south of the territory. And then just to mention that this is an exploratory work, and this contrasts quite a bit with other efforts, such as the Landsat-derived map that I showed earlier, which is again based on a single date, this being based on a large time series, and also the work of Stéphane Guittet and colleagues, which mapped forest types based on the geomorphology. While the patterns don't necessarily look that similar, when we look at the underlying geomorphology from Guittet et al.'s work, we do notice a strong coherence in terms of the north-south patterns visible in both, which would, based on this analysis, seem to suggest that the temporal pattern, the phenology of these tropical forests, if it were, in this case of French Guiana, seem to be linked to the geomorphology. And this would also seem to support or go along with the conclusions of Guittet et al. That in French Guiana, geomorphology is the significant driver or explanatory factor in terms of the distributions of different floristic types. And so, closing off, in terms of the synthesis or the conclusions that we came from that analysis of spatial and temporal patterns, we were able to basically integrate the results from the first 2 axes, looking at spatial variation and looking at temporal variation. And we were able, with this study, to come up with largely a new approach to mapping of forest types. One which, unlike the classical approach, doesn't rely on imagery just from one date, because as we already saw, when we use imagery only from one date, we get, say, certain perhaps biased distributions or distributions which change over time, but rather using a time series approach to exploit how the forest changing over time allows us to see what these forests are. And just to mention again, we see a strong north-south influence, particularly in French Guiana, in terms of these spatial and temporal patterns, which again seem to go along with the work of Guittet et al. And also this north-south pattern contrasts strongly with the east-west pattern we would expect if it were caused by BRDF. And again, there's a strong contrast between what we saw using this time series approach and other previous approaches. Last slide, or second to last slide. In terms of our overall synthesis, just concluding, bringing it all home, what we were able to see was that BRDF does impact the patterns, the spatial patterns in Landsat, in the reflectance estimates that come from Landsat, but not only the canopy reflectance that we estimate from that type of data, but it also influences the estimated distributions of forest types that we would derive from that type of data. However, we've also demonstrated that it is possible to do corrections to Landsat using reference data sets like MODIS, which already have these BRDF corrections. And with that, we can essentially improve our mapping of tropical forest types. So in other words, no more green carpet for French Guiana. And that's, again, looking at the issue, the spatial issue. Looking now at the temporal issues, we found that in the case of French Guiana, the vegetation indices do show us that there is, or do point to phenological variation in evergreen forests, and this variation is independent of potential impacts of BRDF. However, when we look at different regions of the tropics, Central Africa, the Guyana Shield, when we look at these areas, we see that the variation in the vegetation indices is synchronized differently across regions, as we would also expect. So in the case of Central Africa, the studies indicate that the forest there, the limiting factor is rainfall. Therefore, the sequence or the variation in the vegetation indices, therefore, is synchronized to rainfall. In the Guyanas, however, there's sufficient rainfall that the synchronization is based, or the data would seem to indicate, based on the availability of sunlight. And again, previous studies have indicated the same. And we were also able to establish that the variation we see in vegetation indices over time are, again, most closely explained by variation in climate, not by atmospheric noise or by changes in sun's position. And then taking both of those together, we see that when we use a time series approach, we come up with quite a different characterization of distributions of forest types than when we use a classical approach. In terms of perspectives for future work, obviously what was shown here in terms of Axis 3 is quite exploratory and preliminary. And so the next steps that should be taken would concern interpreting the forest types generated from the time series decomposition. And also, in this exploration, we used the approach that we used. We looked at only 5 forest types. However, using this time series approach, it would also be possible to examine more classes, or to dig deeper, as it were, into the green carpet. There's also the important issue of how do we validate these time series patterns that we're seeing. And as mentioned before, in ecology, we're concerned with both pattern and process. The issue would also be to further compare the data, the products that we have, with other environmental data to further understand why is it exactly that we're seeing the patterns that we see. And so with that, I conclude. I'd like to acknowledge so many people, the members of the jury, my advisors, the different entities which provided data for this study, my family, my wife, etc. Thank everybody for, again, all the contributions.